Today we're going to be talking about early childhood development, and we have an esteemed panel of people to be talking. What I'd like for you to do is, if possible, hold your questions until every panelist has been able to talk, and then we can ask questions more broadly. Because this is being taped, if you ask a question, you get the microphone. That way we can get your question on tape. So to start out, I would like to introduce our panelists. To start with, we have Beth Graue here. Beth is a Sorensen professor in the Department of Curriculum Instruction. She's a specialist in early childhood education and has done research on kindergarten readiness, the impact of class size reduction on primary school practices, homeschool relations, and I'm married of other things, I do believe. I think these are the only three you told me about.
I figured you needed to have some time to talk.
She's currently part of a research project on developmentally and culturally responsive mathematics, and is also exploring the experiences of public pre-K programs in Wisconsin and New Jersey. And I want to find out why New Jersey at some point. Next to her is Vanessa Simmering. Vanessa is an assistant professor in psychology here at the UW. Her lab is part of the Weissman Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center, and she is an active member of the McPherson Eye Research Institute on campus. Her research broadly addresses questions of developmental change in memory with a specific focus on visual, spatial, working memory during early childhood and potential underlying neuromechanisms for that change. She employs both behavioral and computational models in her research and emphasizes understanding how context influences children's performance both inside and outside of the lab. Next to her is Haley Vlach. Haley recently joins us from UCLA. She just got her PhD at UCLA, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology. Her research interests are on children's learning, memory, and cognitive development, with a central focus being on connecting more traditional psychological research to applied settings, such as the design of cognitive interventions in the classroom. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, is Anita Wager, who is a assistant professor of mathematics education and curriculum and instruction. Anita's research focuses on broadening notions of teaching mathematics for understanding by incorporating the cultural and socio-political contexts in which the students live and learn. She is particularly interested in professional development that supports teachers as they draw on the rich mathematical resources from students' homes and communities to develop culturally relevant and responsive mathematics pedagogy. In other words, she uses children's context to improve their learning. Dr. Wager's current project extends her research into early childhood in a study of professional development for culturally relevant teaching and learning in the 4K environment. Panelists, take it away.
Well, I would just like to thank Cheryl for inviting us to do this panel. I've been here since 1990, and this is the first time early childhood has cracked prime time. So that's pretty exciting. When we met to talk about what we were going to do in this panel, we decided to frame the work of three newer faculty that span a very interesting range of contexts of doing research related to young children. So we're going to go from the lab to the classroom. And we will start with Vanessa.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak and for everybody who is attending. So I'm, as the introduction said, a professor in the Department of Psychology, and I've done my best to try to make this talk appropriate for a general audience. And I plan to speak for about 20 minutes to have some time for questions at the end. But if you feel there's anything that has to be clarified for you to stay on board with me through the talk, then go ahead and interrupt, and hopefully I can clarify. So I'm going to talk about my own work in which I use neural models to understand developmental improvements in working memory capacity. Most people have a pretty intuitive understanding of what I mean when I say capacity in working memory. So if I showed you a set of objects like this for just 1 second and asked you to remember what it showed, you would be able to remember a subset of those items, but probably not all of them. But when I present objects like this that are more realistic, there are lots of confounds in our understanding of how you're remembering this information. So if I were to ask you, or you may remember the airplane and the kite just flying over the rainbow, and kind of chunk those together as a way to remember more things with fewer mental resources. So you want to?
Just do that.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Just stick that in the pocket.
Yep. Make sure I don't wander away too far. Or you might remember, is that working okay? Yeah, there's some, since I'll be looking there. Okay. You might remember sitting at a desk, and now my laser doesn't want to work, sitting at a desk working on a computer, again, using fewer mental resources to remember more information. So psychologists have started to move these kinds of tasks into the laboratory where we can have a lot more control over the types of information people are remembering and try to get a better sense of what they're using to remember this information. So my own work, I'm going to focus pretty narrowly on one piece of memory capacity. In particular, I'm going to study visual working memory capacity. And one reason I'm interested in visual memory in particular is because in psychology, it's much less well understood than verbal working memory. So verbal tasks have been studied a lot with their obvious connections to the classroom, but visual information doesn't have as much of an obvious connection. However, research has shown that there are lots of special populations that show deficits in visual memory in particular, such as children diagnosed with ADHD, autism, or schizophrenia, or children with developmental coordination disorder, or those who were born preterm with low birth weight. So there are reasons to think that visual memory might also be important for cognitive functions that we think are important to education. And in particular, I study capacity limitations because it's a well-documented but poorly understood limitation in our cognitive systems. Many explanations of limits in verbal capacity don't translate well into visual capacity, so mechanisms like rehearsal of words in memory, it's less obvious how to use that for visual information. And there's also a big gap in the literature, which I'm going to show in a moment, between research in infancy and research in school-aged children. So what I'm going to show you now is the state of the literature when I first started working on this area of research. So what I've got along this figure here, on the bottom I've got different age groups of participants, ranging from infancy, 6 months to 10 months, up through adults on the right-hand side. And on the y-axis here, I'm plotting the capacity estimates derived from various laboratory tasks. So the first plot I have over here, all the way on the right, is from a well-known study on visual working memory capacity in adults that showed a capacity of about 3 to 4 objects. This was followed up by a study with infants that showed a rapid increase in capacity between 6 and 10 months of age from only 1 item to adult-like capacity of 3 to 4 items by 10 months. So the picture at first looked like there was very early, rapid development of visual memory capacity. But later studies came along and tested wider age ranges and showed that there seemed to be a slower developmental progression. So Cowan and colleagues studied school-age children and found a general increase from 7 to 12 years old and then up to adulthood. This was followed by Riggs and colleagues who studied slightly younger children and showed that 5-year-olds had a capacity estimate of only about 1.5 items, so between 1 and 2. So this was the time at which I was introduced to this literature, and I wondered what was going on here that led to this disconnect between infancy and 5 years. So my first study in this area showed with younger children that we get a continuation of this kind of trajectory. So it seems that there's consistency across all of these studies of children that are inconsistent with the studies of adults. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, why it is that we get different estimates from these different age groups. And one reason that I think we get different estimates between these age groups, what's happening between infancy and 3 years, isn't that capacity is decreasing, but rather that we test capacity in the lab in different ways with different populations. So most of those data points I showed you from 3 years and older came from the change detection task. This is a very common task used to measure capacity in adults since about the mid-90s. So in this task, the participant is seated in front of a computer screen. A memory array appears briefly with a small number of simple objects to remember. They disappear briefly and come back, and the participant's job is to say whether all of the items remain the same or one of them has changed. So here's an example of a change trial where green changed to yellow. Then using participants' performance, We can look at how often they get hits, which is correctly identifying a change. Correct rejections are correctly identifying no change. And we can combine these through a formula that's been well established to estimate capacity. So it's not critical to understand the formula, but just know that it comes from the combination of hits and correct rejections. So we can estimate capacity and change detection from your percent correct. For infants, however, it's pretty obvious that this is not an appropriate method to ask a 6-month-old how much they can remember. So instead, the preferential looking task has been developed to study infants. So this is modeled after the change detection task. You can see the similarity here. But infants are seated in front of 2 computer screens that have images blinking off on and off rapidly throughout a 20-second trial. So on each display, you would have, in this case, 3 simple objects, again, just colored squares. On one display with each blink, one of the items changes. This is called the change display. On the other screen, throughout every presentation, the items all remain the same. So what we can look at here with infants, looks like my formatting got lost a little bit, is their change preference, which is percentage of looking. How much time do they spend looking to the change display over the no change display? The idea being if they can hold all of these items in memory, they'll notice that one of them is changing on the change display. That's more interesting to look at, so they'll spend more than half their time looking to the change display. So again, if I go back to this decrease in capacity from 10 months to 5 years or 10 months to 3 years once I added my own study in there, it was clear that these are different tasks that are measuring different behaviors. And so one researcher, so the Riggs et al. Paper argued that perhaps these are different systems, that the preferential looking task is testing more of an implicit memory system and change detection relies more on explicit memory. But the truth is that in order to tell what these tasks are measuring and whether they are indeed measuring the same system is that we need to understand the relationship between the 2 tasks and how they're both tapping this memory system. So my approach to this problem was twofold. First, I was going to compare behavior across tasks within the same group of participants to see how it compares when you probe the same participant's memory, and then also implement both tasks into a single neural network computational model to assess how the memory system relates to the different behavioral measures we get. So in the interest of time, I won't go into the details of the model that I use, but I just want to briefly introduce the class of model that I use and give you a little bit of idea of how it's applied to these tasks. So this type of model is known as a continuous dynamic neural field. So these models are made up of coupled excitatory and inhibitory layers. So what I'm showing you in this figure here is an x-axis that would correspond to the tuning of neurons to a given feature dimension. So in this case, color. So different neurons are tuned to respond to different colors. And on the y-axis, we can think of this as the excitability of those neurons. So when information is presented that corresponds to a given color, this excites neurons in the excitatory field, which then projects to the inhibitory field, which projects inhibition back. And this can get to interactions within and between the fields allow for localized peaks of activation to form. So this is what I'm showing here, a peak corresponding to the cyan color, where you have local excitation within the excitatory field that keeps that peak around, and inhibition feeding back from the inhibitory field that keeps activation from spreading throughout the entire field. So in this case, this model is representing the color cyan. So you can think of peaks as the units of cognition in this model. So when you're remembering an item or perceiving an item, there's a corresponding peak in the model. And these interactions between layers serve different cognitive functions. So when the interactions are tuned to be weak, the excitatory field becomes very responsive to input. So when input is on, peaks form. When input goes away, peaks die out. You can think of this as a more perceptual function. When you strengthen interactions, you get more of a working memory function, where peaks can be maintained in the absence of input. So by combining this perceptual function with weak interactions and the working memory function with stronger interactions, we move to this 3-layer architecture that I use in my work. So one excitatory perceptual field, one excitatory working memory field, and an inhibitory field that is shared. So I'm going to show a quick video here that just gives you an idea of how peaks form and interact with one another in the model. Or so I hope. So here are 3 inputs being presented into the perceptual field. Peaks form there, send activation to the other fields. These peaks have now formed in working memory, and you can see the input has been removed, so the peaks die out in the perceptual field. And the shared inhibitory layer leads to these troughs of inhibition that correspond to the items that are being remembered. And this is how the model is able to recognize something as familiar or identify something that is novel. So what this is showing right here is a new item being presented. It fell outside of that inhibitory trough, created a peak in the perceptual field, and was identified as a new item by the model. So this is the basics of how the model works. Inputs come in. When they're maintained in working memory, they're suppressed in the perceptual field. That's the critical function to understand in order to understand how this model does the behavioral tasks I'm interested in. So this same 3-layer model, so I now have arrows here showing the connectivity between the layers. This 3-layer architecture can perform both of the tasks that I've talked about through different types of behavioral response systems. So a fixation system here that is coupled to the perceptual field can control where the model looks. So in this case, it's a simple 3-node architecture with 1 node corresponding to the display on the left, 1 corresponding to the delay on the right, and 1 corresponding to looking away from the displays. And the interactions among these are such that the model can only look one place at one time. And when the model looks to one of the displays, the colors that are presented there feed as input to the rest of the model. And then these green arrows show feedback to the fixation system such that activation in the perceptual field feeds into longer fixation. So you look at something the more that you're processing it. For the change detection task, we use a decision system that generates a same or different decision based on activation in the working memory versus perceptual field. So as items are being held in working memory, this supports same decision. But when a new item comes in and forms a peak in the perceptual field, that feeds into a different decision. And again, these nodes are coupled such that they compete with one another, and only one is going to generate a response on a given trial. So just a quick summary of how the model performs these tasks. The key to performance is the neural interactions within and between these layers. In the change detection task, peaks in working memory inhibit familiar items, which means that the perceptual field serves as a novelty detector. When a new item comes in, a peak forms, generates a different decision. In the preferential looking task, the peaks in working memory release fixation. So as the items become familiar, perceptual processing is inhibited. That leads the model to want to look away for something that's more interesting, and this produces a novelty preference. So how the model performs these 2 tasks, combined with the differences in how the tasks are structured, leads to some important predictions that I'll go through in the next slide. But I want to just revisit really quickly. In the model, to perform the change detection task, you have kind of 1 quick chance to get those items into memory. You have to hold them for a delay, and you need a relatively robust decision to correctly say whether there was a change or not. In the preferential looking task, though, you have many opportunities to encode these items over the repeated presentations. And so that allows for a weaker memory trace to drive behavior. So I did some initial simulations to look at how the model performed both of these tasks, which led to some predictions that I tested behaviorally. So my predictions essentially come down to the fact that task differences will lead to different estimates of capacity. So when testing the same individuals across these 2 tasks, I predicted that adults would show capacity higher than 3 to 4 items in preferential looking. So this is higher that's been reported in the literature with change detection. And I also predicted that testing both children and adults in these 2 tests together, we would get higher estimates from preferential looking than from change detection in the same participants. But even though I'm predicting that we're going to get different capacity estimates, I think the same memory system is operating in both tasks, and that's captured in that 3-layer architecture in my model. So I predicted that there would be correlations between the 2 tasks in the kinds of behaviors that we see, and then also that there would be parallel developmental trajectories, that I'd be able to show some developmental change in the model that could lead to the behavioral changes we see in each task. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go kind of quickly through my results. So the preferential looking results, so I tested 3, 4, and 5-year-olds and adults in these tasks. So what I'm showing you here is the different age groups, and along the y-axis is the change preference score. So the dashed line shows 50%. Any mean that's significantly above 50% is a significant preference, which leads us to conclude capacity for at least that many items. And all of these means, this is across 3 different set sizes, that's 2, 4, or 6 colors on each display. And all of these means were significantly above chance. So based on how this task has been used to estimate capacity, this leads us to conclude that the capacity is at least 6 items for 3, 4, 5-year-olds and adults. A second behavioral measure I got out of this task was to look at switching. So this is how often participants looked back and forth between the 2 displays on a given trial. And in the model, this ends up being important because it has to do with how quickly memory is formed in that working memory layer, how quickly fixation is released from the perceptual field. So my change preference score here confirmed the first prediction that capacity is at least 6 items. And then what I found with switches here is that you get a similar pattern of performance among the 3 groups of children. So switches are higher in set size 2 than in set size 4 and 6, suggesting maybe it's a little bit easier to remember 2 items than 4 or 6. But for adults, we saw that switches were higher in set size 2 and 4 compared to 6. So we get a significant age difference if we look just at set size 4, where adults are switching more often in 4 than they are in 6. Suggesting that maybe it's adults are actually remembering more information. So even though we see that the change preference scores look similar, we do find more evidence of this developmental change when we look at switches. So as I was saying, this could be because more switching could reflect stronger memory, and the model, as peaks form faster in working memory, you get faster inhibition of the perceptual field and faster release of fixation. So switches may be a more sensitive measure than change preference, at least in this population. So in the change detection task, I looked at percent correct here. So again, this is the same participants. And I've got different set sizes here. I tested set sizes 1 through 5, so between 1 and 5 colors per trial. And you see that when remembering only 1 item, performance is overall pretty good, although little kids have a little bit of a hard time still. But that as the number of items increases, you see, especially for the children, performance falls off greatly. So it's much harder for these kids to remember more items in the change detection task. And the capacity estimates I derived from this percent correct was between about 2 and 3 items for the preschoolers, and then a little over 4 items for the adults. So this confirmed my prediction that all of the estimates from the preferential looking task were higher than the change detection task within the same participants. So, apparently my axes decided to show up before my figure. A little preview of what I'm going to talk about. So I went back, when I started this, I said previous arguments had been if the capacity estimates are different, maybe these are different memory systems that the task is tapping. But my model suggests that the same system can produce these different estimates because of the differences in tasks. So I tested this behaviorally by looking for correlations between the 2 tasks. And multiple measures were related across the 2 tasks. Hopefully my figure will show up eventually. There we go. And the best fit was from a combined model of age and set size 4 switches to predict capacity. So what I'm showing here is switches from set size 4 and capacity here, and these are all my participants and the significant correlation between those measures. So even after partialing out the increase in capacity in the change detection task from age, we still got significant prediction from switches in the preferential looking task, suggesting it is the same memory system in both tasks. Okay, so I'm going to speed through here to make sure I can get to the end. So the question then that comes up is how a single developing memory system could produce such different developmental trajectories across these tasks. And the model that I use has a specific developmental hypothesis called the spatial precision hypothesis. The basic idea is not that complicated, just that stronger neural interactions over development produce peaks that are stronger, narrower, and more stable. So here's a picture of what the peak profile looks like, where this darkest line is early in development and the lighter lines are later in development. So I tested to see whether the spatial precision hypothesis could account for developmental change and visual working memory capacity across these 2 tasks. So I will just show you briefly that my model was able to fit the data I got behaviorally. So these are the behavioral data. This is the model. I fit change preference scores as well as switches in the preferential looking task. And then the dashed lines here are the fit of the percent correct data from the change detection task and yielded very similar estimates of capacity to the behavioral data. So I implemented both of these tasks in a single neural network model and showed that you can get what looks like very different capacities just based on the way that capacity is measured in the lab. So I showed you 4 specific predictions that were supported by behavioral data and simulations, and answered the question of what was happening with this developmental disconnect. So different tasks and different behaviors led to different capacity estimates, even though this was part of the same memory system. So I'll say briefly that the preferential looking task was easier. You were able to remember more items there because there was more support from the input coming on repeatedly as the items were represented, and also a lower threshold for behavior. Only looking to one display over the other about 55% of the time is enough to show capacity, whereas in the change detection task, you need a pretty robust memory in order to correctly respond same or different. So I want to conclude by arguing that computational modeling, this type of neural network model, can help us understand cognition, behavior, and development. And I've shown you examples inside the lab, but my ultimate goal is taking this outside of the lab as well. So the specific hypothesis I showed you is that changes in neural connectivity provide a developmental mechanism in working memory capacity. And I want to argue that this is a more general developmental mechanism that might account for a really broad range of results. So some of my collaborators who use similar models in different areas have shown that this hypothesis can account for developmental changes in word learning tasks, in spatial categorization, and in executive function in the lab. So my last point is just to draw what might sound like a counterintuitive claim. But I believe that by gaining a more specific understanding of tasks in the lab, we can get to a generalization across tasks and beyond the lab. So I don't want to argue that our theories should only account for one specific behavior that we measure in the lab, but rather that understanding that behavior at the very specific level can help us understand how it relates to other kinds of tasks in the lab, and then hopefully tasks beyond the lab as well. And that is the end. Thank you. I think time for a few questions.
Why don't we wait until
The end?
Yeah.
Okay, that works too.
I have to set up, so it might be a good time.
Questions?
One while we transition? Yes. We're saved for later?
Well, I have a question if nobody else does. I was looking at that and I was thinking about how much visual information children have to process.
Right.
And I was wondering if by keeping things the same for repeated presentation, do you suspect that children will be able to focus more on what the change is and can track it? So I'm thinking along the lines of letters, the
Right.
P, B, D, Q. Those are often, kids will confuse, especially the B and the D. Given this research, would you suspect that repeated presentation of the differences between the B and the D would be easier for children to process than if they were given a whole bunch of letters at one time?
Yeah, I do think, so I think there are 2 pieces there that would be important. One is to reduce the overall amount of information that's competing to be processed at once. And that's simultaneously as well as over time. So in the change detection task, we find that one of the things that's hard for kids is that it ends up being a little bit fast-paced for how their attentional systems are really working. So they have to keep attending to the next trial and the next trial, and they're often a little bit stuck in what they were remembering from before. So with the preferential looking task, because there's that support that when something is presented again, it is pretty much the same as what they saw before, they can build a little bit more incrementally. So yeah, that would definitely suggest that showing maybe small changes over time if you're going close in time, but then also reducing the total amount of information. So the switches I found in the preferential looking task, the kids were able to form memory for the information more quickly when there was less information at once. Right. So they did better, they seemed to learn the colors a little faster when there were only 2 versus when there were 4. So I'd say those 2 in combination would suggest a little less information at one time, and then not to change too much over time, at least in the short term, which actually I think feeds in nicely to what Haley.
You're giving Grandma ideas. Are there any other questions while Haley's setting up? Well, then we'll just let Haley set up.
Okay, so what I want to do today is to talk about how memory and neuroscience and mathematical models and neural models and all the great things that Vanessa talked about today connect to learning in the classroom and into educational contexts. Because if Vanessa were to give a talk to a group of teachers or educators, even though she and I see a lot of connections to learning in the classroom or in educational contexts, it might not be so clear to this group how this work connects to the fields and the settings that they're interested in. And so what I'm going to do today is instead of focusing on one type of memory and how that is related to children's learning in the classroom, I'm going to talk about a memory process that's a little bit more broad, which is forgetting. And this is something that we're probably all too familiar with, right? And it turns out that forgetting is the most ubiquitous characteristic of human memory. And there has been, in terms of psychological science, a considerable amount of research that has examined forgetting. And so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the very brief history and background on this research. And what this laboratory-based psychological research has told us is basically how forgetting happens and when forgetting happens. So just to give an overview, one insight that this research has provided is that we forget at all stages of the lifespan. So from the time we're born to the time we die, we're always forgetting. And so this is what's termed developmentally invariant behavior. So this is a learning process that occurs across the lifespan. Another insight is that forgetting is not just a human thing. Other species forget. In fact, even single-celled organisms have been shown to demonstrate forgetting behavior as defined scientifically. Another insight is that we can observe forgetting on multiple levels of analysis. So for example, we can observe forgetting on the level of a single cell or an individual neurons or a field of neurons, such as what Vanessa was talking about. We can also see forgetting in more complex phenomena, such as human behavior, in skill learning tasks, motor learning tasks, and some of the tasks that I'm going to show you today. Finally, across all of these tasks and all the time intervals that have been analyzed, it turns out that we forget according to a very robust mathematical function. And this function looks something like this, and this is termed a forgetting curve. Now, what you'll notice about the forgetting curve is that it's curvilinear in pattern, hence the word curve. But the forgetting and the amount of forgetting is most rapid at first and then slows as time goes on. So in this graph on the x-axis, it's basically time. It's the number of days that have passed, so a month period in this case. And on the y-axis, we see an equation, which is called a saving score. And the way to think about this is it's the percentage or the likelihood that information is going to be recalled at that point in time. So for example, the first dot on the left there, up at 100%, is immediate recall. So if I say the word monkey to you and ask you what did I say immediately, well, likely everybody is going to say you just said monkey, right? However, if I ask you a day later or 2 days later or a month later, the percentage of you that's going to successfully be able to say, oh, she said monkey, is going to decline. And it's going to decline according to this curvilinear pattern. Okay? Now, thus far, you're probably thinking, forgetting is plaguing us. It's a bad thing. It's deterring our learning because we're forgetting all this information that we're acquiring. Well, psychological science has a very different view of forgetting. Instead of forgetting being a bad thing, psychological science has viewed forgetting as a good thing. And the reason for that is forgetting is critical to the efficiency and adaptive functioning of human memory. And it contributes to efficiency and adaptive functioning in two ways. The first way is that we forget information that's not reactivated in memory. So for example, you hearing me say monkey, a year from now, you're probably not going to hear me say monkey unless, I guess, we're talking about monkeys. And so that's good. That's a memory you don't necessarily need to hold on to. So you're going to keep forgetting it over time. However, perhaps you do hear me say monkeys, and maybe my research is on monkeys, and I just talk about monkeys all the time. Well, in this case, this memory is going to be reactivated over and over again. And what it does is it slows the future forgetting of that particular piece of information. So just to be clear about how this works, I'm going to show you some forgetting curves. And let's just imagine that I show you this toy that you've never seen before. Well, what's going to happen, just as we talked about, is you're going to start to forget information about this toy, such as the shape, the color, the texture, according to this curvilinear pattern that we see here. Okay? Now, let's say a few minutes from now, or a day from now, or some amount of time later, I show you another toy that you've never seen before, so this black toy right here. Well, what happens in this circumstance is that information that is similar between the first toy, the pink toy, and the second toy, the black toy, is going to be reactivated in information in your memory. So as that might be the shape. These two objects have the same shape. So what happens is the shape information goes back up to 100%, entering our short-term and working memory. And what you'll notice is information about the shape is forgotten at a slower rate than other information that wasn't reactivated. So the color or the texture of the first toy. Right? And so what happens is when information gets reactivated in our memories, not only does it come back to our working memory, but the future forgetting curve, the subsequent forgetting curve, decreases at a slower rate. Okay? And this is why forgetting contributes to the adaptive and efficient functioning of our memory. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, well, when should this reactivation occur? How should this reactivation occur? And it turns out that in the context of thinking about these questions, timing is a very important variable and goes a lot with the expression, timing is everything. And the reason for this is that because spacing learning events out in time optimizes the reactivation of information along the forgetting curve, introducing forgetting over extended periods of time actually benefits learning. And this is actually quite a counterintuitive idea, so we're going to go back to the forgetting curves to see why this is. So this is the same figure that we saw earlier with one difference. Here I've placed that second toy that you would have been shown at different points in time. So the first one is what you saw before, and it gets reactivated, and the shape information, what got reactivated, is forgotten according to this curve right here. Now, let's say that that was a 5-minute interval. What if I showed it to you after 30 minutes instead of 5 minutes? Well, again, the shape information would be reactivated, but it would take more energy in retrieval to reactivate it. And what happens is that energy is conversely related to the future rate of forgetting. So even though you engage in a deeper retrieval process because it's further along down the forgetting curve, that actually supports the future memory for that information. So what happens is if it's 30 minutes instead of 5 minutes, the future rate of forgetting is slower. Now let's just say with this third toy here, instead of 30 minutes, it's a day later. Well, the same thing happens, right? It's further down the forgetting curve on the pink object. So what happens is it gets reactivated and it takes even more energy to reactivate that, and then the forgetting curve is even slower. So the counterintuitive idea here is that introducing forgetting into learning actually promotes learning. Forgetting is a good thing because if something is forgotten and then you reactivate it over a longer period of time, that's actually a stronger reactivation and thus slows future forgetting. And this phenomenon, back to timing, is called the spacing effect. And it's the most well-researched phenomenon in psychological science. And the short definition is basically what I explained to you just now. If you distribute learning events across time, so in wider and wider intervals, this promotes more memory than massing them together closer in time. Because again, when things are activated close together in time, it doesn't take that much energy to recall what you just saw. So in that case, you don't get as strong a reactivation and forgetting is slower. Okay, so that was my very brief introduction into the functionings of memory and forgetting. Now, I started this by saying that this is a really big body of research. There are literally thousands of studies on this phenomenon, and we've tested across different species, across different tasks, all these different scenarios, but what about education and educational settings? Well, the number of studies that have connected this clear memory phenomenon to education is very limited. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the first study to demonstrate that this phenomenon contributes to children's generalization in the learning context in the classroom, so with educational materials. So when I'm going through this large literature and said, hey, there's a piece of the puzzle missing here, we should find out if it applies to this situation. So I'm going to show you this Let's Find Out study. So the research question, and this is a really clear connection to what I was just talking about, can forgetting or spaced learning promote children's acquisition and generalization of science concepts? Okay? So in short, does this phenomenon connect to educational materials and educational interventions? The second question, which is another theoretical question, is can forgetting or spaced learning promote children's acquisition and generalization of multiple types of concepts? So for example, in the study I'm going to show you, we focused on simple and complex concepts. Now, an example of a simple concept would be what I've been showing you earlier, which is a concept or a category of things that are based on perceptual features. So if you look at these objects right here, they all have the same shape, but they vary in other perceptual features, such as the color or the texture of these objects. Complex concepts are commonly defined as being qualitatively different than these simple perceptual concepts. Complex concepts are based on abstract structures that underlie the world in a way that we can't see necessarily based on perceptual features alone. And if that's not entirely clear, just hold on for a second. I'm going to give you a concrete example coming up here. The participants in this study were 36 early elementary school students, so a mixed grade classroom of first and second graders, and that translates to about 5 to 7 years old in age range. And this was a pre-test, post-test design for an educational intervention. So children received a pre-test, 4 lessons as part of the intervention, and then a post-test. And the scientific concept that we focused on in this study was food chains. And I won't go into why we did, but we did this because it connects most closely to the research that's been done in the laboratory context. Now, each of these 4 lessons occurred in a different biome. So one lesson would be in the grasslands, one might be in the Arctic, one might be in the desert, and one might be in the swamp. Now, you're seeing 5 biomes on this list. Well, the 5th biome was used to do for the pre-test and the post-test. Again, because we wanted children to be generalizing information, it was important that we test them in a context in which they didn't receive instruction. There were 3 experimental conditions in this study, and the first was a masked learning schedule. And again, this is learning that happens with one lesson right after the other. So lessons occur in immediate succession. So what you can see in this chart here is that the 4 lessons were one right after the other on the same day. The second experimental condition was the clumped condition, and this introduced a little bit of massing and a little bit of spacing. So for example, 2 of the lessons would be presented on one day, but all 4 lessons were separated by one day in between. And what this did is this started to introduce forgetting into the learning schedule, right? So here what we see is that there's some forgetting between lesson 1 and 2 and lesson 3 and 4, but probably a minimal amount of forgetting between lesson 1 and lesson 2 and lesson 3 and lesson 4, because they occur one right after the other. And then finally, the third experimental condition was a spaced condition. And what happened in this study is that it was one right after the other each day. And this introduced forgetting, so an interval of time in between each learning event. So we have 3 different levels of forgetting introduced into these 3 different learning conditions. Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier was that it was a pretest and a post-test, and you might have noticed looking through those graphs that the pretest always occurred before the first lesson, hence pretest, before the learning. The post-test in all conditions was 1 week after the lesson, and this was to ensure that the information was retained and generalizable for at least a 1 week period. Okay, I'm going to breeze through the specifics of the stimuli and the lessons. And first, I'll just give you an example of what the pre-test and post-test were like. They were identical to each other. And again, they were tested in a biome not used during the lessons. Because we were testing generalization, we wanted it to be in a novel context. So children received 4 simple generalization questions that were forced choice. And they would go something like this. An experimenter would place cards in front of the child, such as a shrimp card like this. And the experimenter would say, what do shrimp eat? Do shrimp eat tuna fish, sharks, plankton, or sea plants? And it was the child's job to pick out the card that answered this question and hand it to the experimenter. So what's the answer? No one knows? All right, well, the answer is the plankton. Why is the answer the plankton, other than the obvious that's what they eat?
Smaller.
It's smaller, exactly. So what children are doing in this context is they can use size cues, so the sizes of the actual creatures and the sizes of the cards, to guide their generalization. And that's why this is qualified as a simple generalization task. I want to contrast that with the 4 complex generalization questions that they received. So in these questions, the experimenter would propose a scenario to the children. The experimenter would say, let's say that the plankton gets sick and dies. Then the experimenter asks, what happens to the number of shrimp? Does the number of shrimp go up, go down, or stay the same? So it places these 3 cards in front of the child, and it's the child's job to pick up what the correct answer is. Now, what's the correct answer? It goes down. How did you get to this answer? What you were doing is you were using an underlying abstract structure of the way that a food chain operates in the ocean, right? You can't use some perceptual feature in order to answer this question correctly. You have to use a deeper understanding of this structure in order to successfully generalize, okay? And this sort of structure is often termed a food web. Okay? So if you think back to science in elementary school, you might have seen a bunch of animals with arrows going in every which direction. That's a representation of these abstract structures that children have to use in food chain curriculum. I want to show you an example of lesson as well, and again, I'm going to breeze through it for the sake of time. The lessons were relatively brief. They're about 5 minutes long. The first part, we just told them what a food chain is. Children in this study hadn't received food chain curriculum in school yet, and so when they think of a food chain, they told us that that was McDonald's, or it was one of those Fruit Loop necklaces. So we kind of had to tell them what a food chain was in a scientific sense. So we did that. We took a 30-second period to do that. And we'd also introduce the creatures that lived in that particular biome. Now, the concepts were introduced using a tube activity set that looks like this. And we introduced both of the concepts implicitly using this set. So again, remember that the simple concept is the idea that bigger animals typically eat smaller animals. So we would place the tubes in front of the children like this, and what we would do is we'd say, what does the cricket eat? And regardless of what the child responded, the experimenter would pick up the cricket tube and place it on top of the grass tube and say, crickets eat grass. And then the experimenter would say, well, what does the mouse eat? And then regardless of what the child says, the experimenter would pick up the mouse tube and place it on top of the cricket tube. Right? So the experimenter never said to the child, bigger animals typically eat smaller animals, but what's being introduced here is that you can see the perceptual cue of size is cueing the children that the bigger tubes are eating those smaller tubes. We use the same tube set to introduce the complex idea. Again, this is interdependence, that abstract structure underlying food chains. And the experimenter would propose a scenario. So for example, in the grasslands, the experimenter might say, let's say that a farmer comes along and sprays poison on top of the grass. So the experimenter would place a poison sticker on top of the grass. And then the experimenter would say, let's say that the cricket eats the grass. And so the experimenter would pick up the cricket tube and place it on top of the grass tube. And the experimenter would ask the child, so what do we think happened to the cricket? And regardless of what the child said, the experimenter would lean over the tube and say, the poison that was on the grass is now inside the cricket. And the child could look in and see that there, in fact, was the poison. So the experimenter would lean over the tube and say, let's say that the mouse eats the cricket. So again, mouse goes over the cricket, and the experimenter would ask, what happens to the mouse? And regardless of what the child said, the experimenter said, well, the poison that was on the grass that's inside the cricket is now inside the mouse, and lean over the tube, and there, in fact, would be the poison sticker. Again, the experimenter is not explicitly telling the children the idea that there's an interdependence between these creatures, but the children can abstract that between the lessons. Okay, so just a quick reminder that the research question was not, is this curriculum effective, but if we introduce forgetting into this curriculum, will that promote the retention and generalization of information? So I'm going to show you the results. This is the change in performance from the pre-test to the post-test. And what we can see is that children in the space condition had significantly more improvement in their simple generalizations than children in the massed condition. Okay? So this suggests that introducing forgetting during the learning process can support the retention and generalization of simple concepts. Okay, so now I'm going to show you complex generalization, and this one's a little bit more iffy theoretically because a lot of people have argued that this is the context in which forgetting should be bad. Well, lo and behold, we find a similar effect, where children in the space condition significantly outperform children in the clump condition, as well as significantly outperforming children in the massing condition. So even in the context of learning these deep abstract structures, introducing forgetting during the learning process actually supported children's retention and generalization of this complex concept. Okay? And just to wrap up, the implications, the clear theoretical one is that yes, okay, thousands of studies, we left out education. Now we can say that in this context, there's a clear connection to an educational intervention. But if we think a little bit further on into this educational context, I think that this work also sort of begs future work, but also has some clear-cut connections to when we think about timing in our teaching practices, right? And some big sort of theoretical ideas that are out there now in the educational environment are, should we teach according to a block schedule or a traditional schedule? So in a block schedule, typically middle school or high school students, or maybe even elementary school students, would go to 4 classes a day that work, one day right after the other, versus a traditional schedule and where they go to 7 classes a day, but they're distributed more in time. And so when we think about timing, we might be thinking about how we can improve children's memory through these different schedules. Another one that I don't have time to go into deep detail about is spiral curriculum. And timing is inherent to the philosophy behind spiral curriculum. And the idea between this is that in the beginning, while you're starting to teach concepts, they should be closer together in time. But as children master the concepts, these learning events should be distributed further and further apart in time. And indeed, psychological science would agree with this idea. However, there isn't a whole lot of research connecting these forgetting curves and these mathematical functions to spiral curriculum. But I see this as a very important area for future research and a connection between the two fields. And where I want to end is to think about sort of how we started the talks today. And we were really grounded in psychological science and just thinking about how it is that memory develops and how it is that we're learning across the lifespan. And even at first glance, the connection's not so clear. But what I hope I tried to do today is to show how these neural models and these mathematical functions and these laboratory-based studies really can start to bridge into the education and learning sciences as a way of answering some of the questions that both fields are particularly interested in. How do we learn? How do we remember? And how can that be fostered in learning environments such as the lab or the classroom in order to promote learning? Okay. And that's it. Thank you very much. So there's going to be a little bit more setup, I'm assuming.
Right, so you can take questions.
So I will take any questions that anyone has during that process.
Questions?
Yes, Ed. He gets the microphone.
So Haley, one thing that comes out of a lot of this body of work, independent of the educational applications, is the sensitivity on mass versus space practice and the duration between when the study took place and when the testing took place. And can you comment on that? And also, one thing that you kind of went over a little quickly, but I want to sort of underline that point. You said it was a week from the last study session until the test session, right?
Yes. So in this study, you're right. The spacing occurred over days at a time, and the retention interval was a 1-week interval. And a few of you in the audience might think, well, is there something special about that amount of time? Or, what about other intervals of time? And that's particularly interesting when we think about traditional versus blocked or spiral curriculum, where learning happens over years at a time. And the good news is that because this is such a well-researched phenomenon in psychological science, we do have evidence from the millisecond, second to second time scales, as well as over years at a time. So my favorite study is very cute and theoretically important, which is by Barrick, and Barrick. It's a family that dedicated themselves for 9 years to learn different types of information on a wide array of mass versus space schedules. And what they demonstrated as a family is that even over 9 years at a time, we still see these really persistent effects of timing. Now, this isn't the only study that's been done over years at a time. That's more limited over these extended periods, just like longitudinal research is limited in general. But I think that it speaks to how strong the implications of this research are for education. Okay. Any other questions? All right.
So it's interesting to go third because
since it's been 19 minutes since the first presentation and I had all these really good ideas that I was going to connect to mine, I've already forgotten them. But
it's a good thing. It's tomorrow you'll be better, yeah.
But one thing I want people to do as they're watching this presentation, which is really taking you inside one classroom, is think about some of those visual things that might be evident here. Subitizing comes to mind for me. And then also think about the way the teacher is engaging children in learning in this classroom, in a play-based classroom. How is she spacing out learning opportunities? And this just came up. It'd be fun for me to go back into the data and look at it. I get the pleasure of talking about how some of these ideas play out in a play-based classroom. Just a little background first. There's a lot of research that provides evidence that learning in early mathematics provides students with better grades later, and not just in mathematics, but across all areas. There's research that says exposure to literacy in early grades really helps with literacy later, but mathematics kind of gives you learning across the board. That research, combined with lots of the international studies of mathematics learning and concerns about the achievement gap, has put this work, thinking about teaching young children in mathematics, in this interesting context where we know from all the research in early childhood that play-based environments really support children's socio-emotional development, and it's the rich spot for children to learn. But then there's this push to move academics down. And in fact, there have been some recent policy releases that have talked about how we should start really spending more time, focused teaching time of mathematics in pre-K classrooms. So that's kind of the environment that we're in right now. The context of the classroom I'm going to share with you now is part of a larger study. It's a professional development that Beth Graue and Tom Carpenter and myself are involved in, where we are combining the three ideas of developmentally responsive practices with early number and funds of knowledge. And this is a 4-year study with lots of teachers involved in the professional development. But today we're just going to look at one teacher. And I'm going to introduce you to Marie. All of the photographs today are actually from Marie's classroom. I spent all of last year, I was in her classroom 2 to 3 times a month for 3 hours at a time, taking ethnographic field notes, observing, taking photographs, engaging with children. And then as I analyzed the data, I was really looking for those spaces in which children were learning mathematics and how Marie set that up in the classroom. So one thing about Marie's class is that she really supported kids in developing this really positive disposition towards mathematics, which the research says is very important, especially if we develop these positive dispositions early. She had established this environment where kids just felt like they could count all the time, they could count anything. Math was just fun for them. In this particular example, these 2 little girls are at the puppet theater, and they're counting these Beanie Babies that they've lined up. The puppets are counting them. And the one little girl, Althea, is leading the counting, and the girl behind her, Marta, her English is not as proficient, and her first language is Spanish. So she's actually counting, like, kind of echoing the counting here. So especially after it hit 10. This is a video, and unfortunately I can't show it to you because some other kids walk through, and I don't have permission from those children or from their parents. But they both kind of count together up to 10, and then all of a sudden Althea's sort of leading the counting, and it's 11, 11, 12, 12, 13, 13. Well, actually they skipped 13, but they were working on it. But anyway, so this just occurred. You know, this is one of those things that happened in her classroom. So to understand or to talk about teaching mathematics in play, I first want to talk about kind of how I was positioning play as I thought about this. And I looked at the scholarship in both early childhood and in learning mathematics in play to develop these ideas. It's an important source of development. It's a prerequisite to their learning. It's a place where children move between the real world and this imaginary space. And an important part of this in terms of the mathematics is that children have a lot of opportunity to learn mathematics in play when the adults mathematize the mathematics that the children are engaging in. And part of that mathematizing may be actually providing the words for children about what they're doing, but it might be reactivating too, which just occurred to me. In terms of the research on math and play, there's several aspects of it that scholars are talking about. There's 2 parts. There's the child-initiated, and then there's also teacher-initiated, sort of opportunities for both. One of the roles of the teacher in an early childhood classroom is to introduce new concepts and vocabulary to children. And another thing is that happens is teachers introduce ideas, and then kids just pick them up in play. They just decide to do them. They mimic what had happened earlier in the class or earlier a couple days ago. And another sort of suggestion or recommendation that teachers who really support mathematics learning in a play-based classroom is incorporating it in daily routines and transitions. And so I had all these ideas in mind from the research, and then I looked at Marie's classroom and looked at all the data from her class, and I found that there were really 3 ways that kids had opportunities to learn math and play. And it was really because Marie was going to plan and prepare and respond. And in planning, these were intended practices that she meant to do with the children. Preparing was seeding the environment, and I'll go into that in a bit. And then responding was engaging with the children as they engaged with the math. So in planning, it was the daily routines that she had established for the class, transitions, and then sometimes explicit activities. In preparing the environment, those were, we've been calling this seeding the environment, and it's, preparing the environment is a hallmark of early childhood. I feel funny talking about this in front of Beth Graue, who's like a master of early childhood, and I am learning about it. But it's really a hallmark of early childhood practice, is having the environment ready for children to learn. And in this case, specifically to learn mathematics. And so it might be different games that are provided in the classroom, manipulatives that are placed there, and just how interest areas are set up to support learning. And then in terms of responding to math and play, there were two places where I saw the children really engaging in math when they had completely free choice time. And one were just spontaneous things that they came up with. They'd just be doing something, and all of a sudden it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just, no one asked them to count the tiles. Sometimes you didn't know what they were counting. And then sometimes it was linked to an activity. So perhaps the teacher had taken out attribute blocks earlier, and the kids would go and find attribute blocks during play and start putting them together in different shapes. So I'm going to share some of the actual practices in Marie's class. And this one is during her daily routine. It's what I categorize as an intended practice. She had a number of the day, and every day the kids would, at the beginning of the year, one child would roll a die, and then the whole class would count the pips on the die, and then proceed to do some other activities, such as moving some magnets on a board into a gumball machine that was drawn on the board, which you'll see in a minute. And then they also would slide that number of the day over on a counting frame. Over the course of the year, Marie added more die, so that at this point, she's actually got 3 die out, and this child is leading the class in counting. What was nice about this progression over the year is it moved from just counting to having the children be able to count on, and it was also helped them with subitizing. And when they were subitizing, could they subitize the large number and then count on from that? Could they subitize both and put them together? So the other part, and this is the example of the gumball machine. So if they rolled a 7, they would have to take 7 of the magnets and put them in the gumball machine. And one day when I was in there, Marie forgot to take the gumballs out from the morning class. And so there were already gumballs in there. And when the kids rolled the die, they rolled 8, and she looked up, and there were already 6 in there. And she just decided to give it a try and asked the children, said, well, there are 6 there, and how many do we need to have? And the kids came up, figured out that they needed to have 2 more. And this became a practice that she engaged with in both classes, her morning and afternoon class, where she always left the gumballs in from the class before. So the children were they were figuring out, it was basically a change unknown problem, and it supported them in this problem-solving idea in a really real context for them. Some of the transitions, and I didn't have a good photograph of this one, she always had some kind of math practice during transitions. Even as kids were moving, she'd say, show me 4 at the beginning of the year, and then she might say, show me 5, show me another 5, how many is that? One of the things that she would do when we were waiting in line for the bathroom is she might say, and this happened later, because it started to get, she kind of increased the complication of these problems. She'd say, well, we have 9 children out here, and we know that there are 15 children in class today. How many are in the bathroom? So again, it's supporting the kids on a regular basis to engage in problem solving in a context that was very real to them. Another intended activity were explicit practices. I call this one Yikes because she was reading a book called Yikes, which talks about different animals and the environment they live in. And she got to, as she's reading about each of these animals, she gets to the Bengal tiger. And the Bengal tiger is 10 feet long. And she realizes that the children might not have a very good idea about what 10 feet looks like. So she pulls out rulers and has the children, so it's very, this wasn't necessarily planned in advance last year when I observed, it is planned this year. So she pulls out the rulers and had the children lay 10 rulers down on the ground to see how long that was. In terms of preparing the environment, she had lots of different games, and also they weren't just placed in one space. So she had games and manipulatives placed around the room, so it wasn't confined to just, this is the math area. She had lots of linear board games, which have been shown to support kids in counting. And the linear board games, these are just homemade games that she made. She also made the spinners. And in this case, Kevin and Kara are playing this number race game. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about what happens. So Kevin keeps winning this game. And I start watching Kevin play, and I notice that Kevin will see he just needs 2 more. And so when he spins, he'll put his finger down so that he lands on the 2. And Kara's not really noticing this at all. And he keeps winning and keeps winning. And then Kara doesn't want to play anymore. And so he changes the game. And he said, well, let's make this a game about patterns. That's how he said it was patterns. And so they used different colors to go down and then would line up different colors at the end. But eventually, Kara has quit. And she doesn't want to play anymore. He's always winning. And I don't know if you can see why he might be winning. I didn't notice this until I played with him. But when I was playing with Kevin, I kept losing. And I knew he was cheating, but I was really losing. And then I looked at the spinners. And I said, Kevin, do you notice any difference between the spinners? And he just got this great smile on his face. And he said, well, mine has a 4, 5, and a 6. And yours has 2, 1, 2, 3s. And I said, well, then who do you think will win? He said, well, me. I'm going to win. And, he's 4 years old, and he has figured out this probability problem, which was then, I talked to the teacher later and asked her about the spinners. And she had several sets of spinners. And so kids could choose, and he purposefully had pulled these out. So he was a fun one to watch all year. Another example are sort of like typical math manipulative type things, like geoboards, where kids would just start exploring pattern and area. You wouldn't necessarily think of erasers as a manipulative, but the kids absolutely love these, and they'd use them, they'd count them, they'd sort them, they'd start comparing sizes. So these were also something that were put in all different places in the classroom. In terms of sort of the different interest areas in the classroom, in the sensory table, Marie changed it very often for different things. And here, the kids are just they're measuring and comparing. They're pouring a lot of water back and forth on each other too. But and this engagement that's going on, is Marie would come over and ask them, well, who has more water? And how can you get more water in yours? And they would be able to respond to these ideas. This was not the only place that she set up the environment. The dramatic play area there was often some kind of commerce going on in the dramatic play area. So there would be money and a cash register and just lots of opportunities for children to engage in math. So the hardest part for a teacher, and the part where a lot of researchers who are recommending that we have a much more structured math time, the hardest part is being able to respond in play, or respond to children as they're engaged in play. And you really have to know the mathematics so that you can see it. You have to know when it's happening. You have to know how to engage the children in talking about it, because you don't want to interrupt the play so that they stop, but you want to mathematize and reaffirm the ideas of what they're doing. So some of the places that kids would engage in mathematics might be in blocks. And sometimes they, just on their own, start describing what's going on. In this particular case, this little boy was building something, and Marie asked him, so what is that? And this is just a slice of what he said, but he went on and described this in great detail. He said, the cylinders are poison tanks, and you have to be really careful. There's a trap way into the house, but you'll die if you go in that way. And he described each shape for every block, and these are three-dimensional shapes that he's describing. And she then reinforces this by talking about the shapes, especially with other children who don't necessarily know those three-dimensional shapes yet. In terms of ideas that are connected, in terms of the ways that that the children connected their play to other activities, the counting frame was an important part of the daily routine. But they would often go up and start working on a counting frame during play. And in this case, Joel went over and he moved 5 beats to each side and then just announced, they are the same. And no one asked him, and no one said, well, can you explain what you've done? But he says, they are the same. And again, this is the opportunity where the teacher has to come in and reinforce that idea. What do you mean by the same? How do you know they're the same? So what this suggests, and in closing, I argue that by incorporating all 3 of these different practices in the classroom, that we can interrupt this play academic debate and sort of even things out so that we can maintain play-based classrooms, yet still have plenty of opportunities for children to learn rich mathematics. And that's it. Thank you.
Not to depress you further, but I believe that I heard that there are 3 states that now are doing achievement testing on mathematics and reading in kindergarten, beginning of the year, end of the year, and the teacher's pay is based on how much kids have learned by the end of the year.
And that's why it's getting pushed down to 4K.
So, questions?
One of the things I noticed from this is how siloed our practices are. You two share language and perspectives. And there was some sharing between you two. But the idea that we have teaching in one department, learning in another department, and then psychology, who knows what they do, in another building completely on another part of the campus is a problem. And what I'm wondering is what we could learn from each other. And as an early childhood educator, I have spent a lot of time being told how to do my practice by child development experts. And I keep wondering what would happen if we talked to each other.
Well, so we have a similar training in psychological science, as you pointed out. And I found the study that I showed earlier, it's a game, it's playing, right? And the inspiration for that being the educational intervention was to actually go out into these early elementary school classrooms and talk to the teachers and to figure out what's the context in these real world situations under which learning is occurring. And that was highly valuable, because if I hadn't have done that, the study would have looked very different. There probably wouldn't have been any play, right? There probably wouldn't have been a task that actually models the types of learning that we saw from her talk going on in these early education contexts.
How did you know to do that? And why did they let you do that?
Well, you have to be a little self-aware and know that you have limitations in your own experiences. So, for example, I've never been an early elementary school or preschool teacher. And so I have visited these schools to do research and to talk to parents and educators. But, I just knew that I didn't really know what's going on in the science context. And so If that's the case, I know I need to go and figure that out before I design a study that's supposedly modeling real-world learning. So I guess even though it's not that informative an answer, the answer is having a little bit of self-awareness that we need to do that in order to be connecting different areas of research.
So people have to be aware not only of what they do know, but what they don't know.
Right.
And as I listened to both of you, I just thought, wow, I think the three of us should sit down and talk, because you can tell me these ideas that help me understand how children learn, and then bring it into the classroom and support teachers in understanding, how to pace things out or how to set things up visually for them or whatever it may be.
And I think one of the big, a bit of a subtext in my talk was psychology research over the years, for whatever reason, has moved into this fractionation where we want to break everything down into these tiny little systems, and then we study this one little bizarre lab task and feel like we know how people think. And one thing that I'm trying to do is argue that, okay, it's great to understand how people do this one little lab task, but until you can connect that to anything else, all you understand is how they do this little lab task. And so research like the research I do is challenging to connect, because I'm looking at this very small window of memory. I don't know if kids are learning anything that lasts after they walk outside the room. I have to control the environment to get them to even pay attention to the thing I want to test. And so a psychologist looks at a classroom and says, there's way too many things going on there. There's way too many, there's all this competing information. I talked at the beginning about separating verbal and visual. Almost nobody studies both of those together in psychology because we do this fractionation. And so until psychological research can start, putting Humpty back together again and saying, okay, well, now we know how you do this little task and this little task. We have to think about how those work together. We're going to have a really hard time translating our research outside. And I do think there is there's beginning to be an effort to move in that direction, but we're slow to change. And so we'll see how, hopefully we can start making some progress from within.
And I'd like to suggest that special education has been trying to bridge the world for years, although a lot of the kids that we work with have other issues going on too.
One of the issues that you hear them talk about in the IES is fidelity of implementation. Because when you develop this new sort of intervention, you want to make sure that the dosage that you're given is significantly different from what this business as usual is, right? So one of the things you want to know is, what is that contrast? So to what extent do we know what goes on in the average classroom? To the extent that the average classroom makes any sense, to what extent do we have data even on what the average classroom looks like? So even if I take Anita's work, which is really interesting, that's in one classroom, how do I know what's going on overall so that I can design an intervention so that it even makes sense to think about, what kind of contrast I'm setting up?
I think part of that is doing a lot more ethnographic work in classrooms. We actually, the classroom I observed last year was one of 8 that we observed. So we actually have information on, 8 of 75 or 4K classrooms in just here. But the more we have, the more we can start to look at the similarities and differences. I don't think there is an average classroom. I think they're all very different, and they're different every day.
I think the other piece is we're going to learn a lot from the MET project, where they have 8 gajillion miles of video of practices in classrooms. I don't know what that project is. Then you should go Google it. It is
Measures of effective teaching.
yes, where the Gates Foundation has funded these observational studies where they have a video camera in the ceiling, and they're going to be providing all kinds of training to new faculty to do analyses of these data. It's just for you.
Other questions? Dawn, I thought I saw your hand up. Do you still have that question?
Well, my question was kind of similar to what he was saying is, so when you think about 4K being instituted in the school district, and everybody's excited about it, but with all classrooms being different, as a parent, when you're ready to take your child to school, you know they need to learn, but you don't know how they learn. And you see these cool things, but it's based on your concept and not theirs. So how does it connect then to a parent choosing what's best for their kid?
In terms of the classroom that you, or?
You're presented with all these options, and so as parents, we try and do our due diligence and specifically talk to parents and observe. But how do we then connect what we're observing to what's best for our child?
So I think that's a really personal question too, because everybody's doing different things at home with their children and engaging with their children in different ways in the home, and that is supporting children in different ways. And what is it that you want for your own child? We're doing this professional development with, and many of the teachers in Madison's 4K have participated. So lots of them have increased focus on mathematics, I think we could safely argue. But that might not be what you want for your child as a 4-year-old. I don't know. I would put that back to you. I don't know.
Yeah, I do.
I'll expand on it.
Okay.
Sorry. So also in Madison, we have now dual immersion. And so we have many parents who aren't bilingual, who doesn't come from a bilingual background, but maybe you've read that it's a good thing, and if you have it available, yes, your kid should go into it. But then you have other parents also who don't have any background, who are like, no, I don't think I want that for my kid. I'm not sure. So how do you decide, is what I'm asking.
Well, I think I was going to actually, in response to the last question too, bring up, there's not much research developmentally on this, but in cognitive psychology, there's lots of research on individual differences and trying to think about how different people approach the same problem in different ways. And that makes one teaching method more effective for some of those people than for others. Now, this hasn't been applied much developmentally because it's a really hard question. We don't necessarily even know the relevant dimensions on which children differ to try to come up with what are the important individual differences. And I think that relates to this question. So this is a question close to my heart. I have a son who's about to turn 3. And thinking about what are we going to do with him next? He's home with a nanny this year. We going to do preschool? Are we going to look into 4K? What are we going to do with this? And as someone who knows so much about developmental psychology, it's kind of an extra hard question for me. But in some ways I feel a little comforted because if there's one thing I've learned from all the research is there are many different paths to successful development. And I really resist the idea that there's going to be one way the classroom should be. And everybody should go to the same kind of classroom. And because we can't have the perfect classroom for every child, I do think that it comes back to the parents and thinking about the environment you set up for your child outside of the classroom as well. And I find it a little interesting. I shy away from this push towards earlier education, even though obviously I value education, but I want to make sure my 3-year-old can play too. And so I was really excited to see what you were talking about and demonstrating that we don't have to have a structured classroom curriculum in order to be educating our children. And that maybe, for me, is the take-home message from this, that there are lots of opportunities for learning and that there are lots of different ways that kids can learn in the classroom. And maybe if you want your child to be bilingual, that's something they can't learn at home, so that is something you seek out in a classroom. But it's not going to make or break your child's future. You know, there are many paths to success, and if that's not the way they take, there are still other ways to go on and be successful.
I had a bunch of questions about the remembering and forgetting presentations, but so I decided to limit them to 2. Okay. One is about the physiology of remembering and forgetting. So when you learn something and then you forget it, is it still there and you just can't find it, or it's not there? And then the second question is, it sounded, Haley, in your presentation, the examples you gave, if I tried to draw an analogy to a classroom, what came to mind immediately was like a social studies class where names and dates. So if you learn all the names and dates all in one shot, and then you go over it and over and over it, and you cram them in one day, you don't remember them as well as if you learn it again, repeatedly. Whereas I wasn't sure if the same kinds of content that there was, I wasn't sure whether the kind of content that we're being asked to remember matter. So would it be different if it was something like a technique? Here's how you boil water away from salt water and you just end up with salt, or here's how you implement the quadratic formula or something like that. So does the content matter, and where is the thing we forgot?
So I'm going to start with number 2 because that's a lot easier to answer. We can maybe
we can tag team
take
number one.
But for your second question, this is actually something that's been a more recent in terms of this literature question of, does it just apply to memorizing lists of words or lists of facts in the social studies class? Well, up until, recently, we've only knew that it was like motor learning tasks and maybe some complex motor tasks and these memory tasks that we use in the lab. And researchers have really started to try to examine this phenomenon in different types of learning. And so just to give an example, what I showed today was a generalization task, right? Where it's not just remembering a certain item of information, but generalizing it to a novel piece of information or novel context. And it's the more the research comes out, the more it seems to suggest that this is a phenomenon that promotes learning across these different contexts. And sort of the second part of number 2, so 2B, is yes, I think that there's a very big difference between the cramming phenomenon and the spacing it out. And this is advice that I give to the undergrads when they're studying for their exams. I say, okay, you can cram and you might do okay on this test, but what happens a few days later? Do you remember anything that you learned? Do you want to remember what you learned in college? And so I give the advice that they should be spacing out and studying a little bit per day rather than cramming in all those hours the night before the test. Now, I don't know how many of them take that advice, but certainly across all the different classes they're taking, that should be good advice based on psychological science. Now, question number 1 is a very good question. It's a big theoretical question. Do you want
Well, I was going to say, so I was thinking about that question with regard to the task that I showed. And what I was showing was memory for items that we believed these participants are already familiar with. So we're not really asking them to remember anything new. We're asking them to remember a subset of what they already know as what they just saw right now. And that might be a really different kind of memory than what we want kids to do in a classroom. And so the ways in which memory fails in the context that I study might not relate that well to the ways in which memory fails in other contexts. But the kinds of contexts that I study memory in, I think, is more looking at what I would call the front end of the processing. So what are you encoding right now? So you can divide memory up into 3 basic processes of encoding information, maintaining that information, and retrieving that information. And the hardest thing about studying failures in memory is that we only get access at the end of these 3 processes. So we don't know where, or it's very hard to find out where the failures are occurring. And so this is a question that psychological research has been grappling with for a long time, and we've come up with different methods for trying to assess when information might be present but not easily accessible. So there's various behavioral methods to try to get at this. So one of the well-studied differences is between recall and recognition memory. Something I'm grappling with in my course right now as I go between multiple choice and short answer items, that you typically do a lot better on recognition than you do on recall, suggesting that the information is there, but maybe there's a different threshold that needs to be met. But those are, the classic questions that I think we're just starting to get some traction on, and that one promising avenue is to look at how the brain is operating in different contexts and how we can try to decode the information that's being held there, as giving us some insight into when is something really gone, is it never really gone, it's just too far in there to access.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on to that, the rolling assumption that the field has taken is that our memory is infinite. We can remember everything and that it's always in there. But the reason that we can't get it is some sort of retrieval error. Or inefficient encoding in the first place. And we don't really know if that's true. And like Vanessa said, some of the work that she's doing and other people are doing on the brain really are starting to get some insights. There are some hot debates that are sub-questions of that, but we still don't know from just a basic science perspective of what our capacity is and why it is that we're forgetting.
That eases the aging brain. It's still there.
Yes.
Yeah, you just might have to dig a little deeper to find it.
We're assuming so.
Are there any other questions? If not, then I would like to thank everybody for coming.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
It was very interesting.
It was a lot of fun.
I was thinking about kids that were in the past, first of all, with the visual memories.
Yeah.
Because we do a lot with visual memory, but then with this idea of spacing out versus massing. And I think special education's tried to fit somewhere in the middle of both
Yeah.
of those things, where you'll do mass trials, but then you'll space them out.